The clock on the classroom wall read 9:47 a.m. when Mrs. Eyes scanned the room looking for volunteers to present their weekend essays. Sarah, sitting in the third row by the window, immediately hunched lower over her desk. She hoped, desperately hoped, that if she made herself small enough, invisible enough, her teacher's gaze would simply slide past her like water down a drain. It didn't work. "Sarah," Mrs. smiled warmly, her pen hovering over the attendance sheet, "would you like to share your essay about your family trip to the coast?" Sarah's heart stopped. Then it started again, rapidly, violently, as if trying to escape her. Her mouth went dry. Her hands, which had been resting calmly on her desk just moments before, began to tremble. She could feel every single eye in the classroom turning toward her. 23 pairs of eyes. She counted them. She always counted them when anxiety spiked. 23 witnesses to her impending humiliation. She grabbed the small notepad she always carried and wrote in shaky handwriting, "Can I pass?" Mrs. Smile faltered slightly. Sarah saw the flicker of confusion, then what appeared to be disappointment. "It's a wonderful essay, Sarah. I'd love to hear you read it aloud." This was the part that never made sense to anyone. Not her teachers, not most of her classmates, not even some of her relatives who didn't understand that selective mutism wasn't shyness, wasn't rudeness, wasn't a choice. At home, Sarah talked constantly. She told her mother elaborate stories about the dragons living in the garden shed. She sang off-key Disney songs at the top of her lungs while doing homework. She argued with her father about whether chocolate chip cookies or Oreos were superior. This debate had been ongoing for 3 months. She was funny, creative, talkative, but only within the safety of her own home. The moment she stepped into Riverside Elementary's front doors, something locked inside her chest. It was like someone had installed a deadbolt on her throat, and only her parents held the key. The anxiety that accompanied her inability to speak wasn't just nervousness. It was a physical sensation, like drowning on dry land, like her body was betraying her most basic human function. "Sarah," Mrs. was still waiting, pen poised. The classroom had gone silent. Sarah could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant sound of another class laughing down the hallway, and her own blood rushing in her ears. She shook her head slowly. Then she wrote on her notepad again, in letters so large and dark they nearly tore through the paper, "Sorry, I can't." Around her she caught the subtle shifts. A boy named Devin rolled his eyes and muttered something to his friend that made them both snicker. In the front row, Madison, the kind of girl who never struggled with anything, turned around and gave Sarah a look of pure confusion mixed with something that looked like pity. Someone else whispered, but not quite quietly enough, "Why is she even here if she can't talk?" The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Why was she here? What was the point of existing at school if she couldn't participate, couldn't answer questions, couldn't be like everyone else? Mrs. sighed, a soft, almost inaudible sound, but Sarah heard it. That sigh said everything: disappointment, frustration, maybe even a hint of judgment. "Okay," Mrs. said, turning back to her desk. "Then Michael, would you like to share your essay?" Michael practically leaped out of his seat, thrilled for the opportunity. As he stood at the front of the classroom, reading with theatrical flair about his family's camping trip, Sarah felt something sharp and painful settle in her chest. Envy? Shame? A mixture of both. The rest of the school day was a blur of anxiety and avoidance. Sarah ate lunch alone, as usual, in the corner of the cafeteria, while around her, clusters of children laughed and traded snacks and made plans for after school. She'd been invited to join Madison's friend group once, back in 2nd grade. She'd tried. She'd sat down with them, her throat already constricting with anxiety. They'd asked her questions, and when she couldn't answer, when she could only shake her head or write notes, they'd looked at each other with uncomfortable glances and eventually drifted away. By 3rd grade, they'd stopped asking. After school, Sarah's mother picked her up at the usual time, worked part-time as a nurse, adjusting her schedule to be available for Sarah's pickup. She could see immediately that something was wrong. Her daughter's face was flushed, her backpack clutched to her chest like armor. "Rough day?" asked gently as they pulled out of the parking lot. Sarah's lip trembled. She didn't write a note this time. She just let the tears come, silent and heavy, streaming down her 9-year-old cheeks. Her mother reached over and squeezed her shoulder without pushing for an explanation. After 9 years of parenting a child with selective mutism, had learned that sometimes the kindest thing was simply bearing witness to the pain. That evening, as Sarah sat at the dinner table picking at her rice and vegetables, her father, David, noticed her withdrawn demeanor. He worked as an engineer and had a tendency to want to solve problems, to find logical solutions. Selective mutism wasn't logical. It didn't respond to pep talks or reasoning or gentle encouragement the way most childhood challenges did. "Your mother told me it was a tough day," David said carefully. "Want to talk about it?" Sarah shook her head. She went to her room and lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of her parents talking in the kitchen, their concerned voices rising and falling in the rhythm of people who loved her desperately, but didn't know how to fix something that seemed fundamentally unfixable. That night Sarah had a nightmare. She dreamed she was standing in the middle of the gymnasium during a school assembly, and every single student in the school was pointing at her, laughing, their mouths moving but producing no sound, just silence, endless suffocating silence. She woke at 2 a.m. with her heart racing and crawled into her parents' bed, something she hadn't done in years. Her mother held her without asking questions. By morning, Sarah had made a decision that would define her final years at Riverside Elementary. She would make herself even more invisible. If she couldn't speak, if she couldn't participate, if she couldn't be like everyone else, then she would shrink away completely. She would become so small, so quiet, so utterly unremarkable that nobody would even bother trying to call on her anymore. She would be the girl everyone forgot existed, and somehow that felt safer than being the girl everyone mocked for what she couldn't do. She had no idea that this decision, this desperate attempt to disappear, would eventually lead her to the most visible and important moment of her young life. She had no idea that sometimes you have to be completely broken before you can be beautifully whole. All Sarah knew was that she couldn't face another day of being the invisible girl that everyone could see. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a sealed envelope addressed to Sarah and family. Sarah's mother opened it at the kitchen table while Sarah did homework upstairs, completely unaware that her entire world was about to shift on its axis. "Sarah," her mother called out, "come down here, I have wonderful news." Sarah's stomach tightened immediately. Good news from school usually meant being put on the spot, but curiosity won out over anxiety, and she descended the stairs slowly. Her mother stood in the kitchen, beaming, holding a certificate with Sarah's name printed in elegant script. "Your artwork was selected for recognition at the school assembly," said, pulling Sarah into a hug. "They're giving you an award. This is incredible, sweetheart. Your teacher said your painting about the ocean sunset was the most creative in the entire 5th grade." Sarah's mouth went dry. An award at the assembly, in front of the entire school. "They want you to come up on stage and talk about your inspiration," her mother continued, clearly excited. "It's only a few sentences, nothing to be nervous about. You're so talented, Sarah. This is your moment to shine." Sarah's heart began its familiar frantic rhythm. She looked at the certificate without really seeing it. A moment to shine, more like a moment to shatter. She'd managed over the past year to make herself invisible at school, sitting in the back, avoiding eye contact, perfecting the art of disappearing. And now, just when she'd found a way to survive, the school wanted to drag her into the spotlight. That night Sarah didn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the certificate on her dresser, anxiety gnawing at her like a living thing in her stomach. By morning, she'd considered every possible escape route. Faking illness, telling her parents the certificate was given to a different Sarah, running away, she didn't plan this very well, or simply refusing to go to school. Her parents, however, were adamant. They sat her down the night before the assembly. "Sweetheart, we know this is scary," her father said gently, "but you've worked so hard on your art. People need to know how talented you are." "You don't have to give a long speech," her mother added. "Just a sentence or two, we believe in you." But belief didn't unlock the deadbolt on her throat. Belief didn't stop the anxiety that made her feel like she was suffocating in her own skin. The assembly was scheduled for 10 a.m. on Wednesday. Sarah felt like she was walking to her execution as she entered Riverside Elementary that morning. The gymnasium was already packed with students, parents, and teachers. The bleachers were full, rows and rows of faces, of potential judgment, of witnesses to what she was certain would be humiliation. Principal Davis stood at a podium on the stage, adjusting the microphone. "Good morning, everyone," his voice boomed through the speakers. "Today we celebrate our most talented and dedicated students." Sarah sat in the designated area with the other award recipients, a group of kids who actually looked excited to be here. Devin was getting an Academic Achievement Award. Madison had one for her community service project. A boy named Tyler was receiving recognition for his athletic accomplishments. They all looked calm, confident, like being on stage didn't terrify them on a cellular level. "Our next award," Principal Davis announced, "is for artistic excellence. This student created a painting that moved our entire art faculty. We received unanimous agreement that this was the most inspiring artwork submitted by any fifth grader this year. Please give a warm welcome to Sarah." The applause was deafening. Sarah's legs didn't want to work, but they carried her forward anyway, like they belonged to someone else entirely. She walked to the stage, each step feeling like it took an hour. The gymnasium lights were bright, impossibly bright, and she could feel all 800 pairs of eyes drilling into her. Principal Davis smiled warmly and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, your painting of the sunset over the ocean is absolutely beautiful. Can you tell us what inspired you to create this piece?" The words were a simple question delivered kindly, but Sarah's anxiety didn't care about kindness. Her throat constricted. Her vision started to tunnel. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Not a whisper, not a breath, nothing. Just her face turning a shade of red so vivid that she wondered if she might actually combust. Someone in the audience coughed, a nervous, uncomfortable sound that broke the silence. Then came the snickers, soft at first, then spreading like wildfire through the gymnasium. Sarah could see mouths moving, could see shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. This was it. This was the moment she dreaded. This was the confirmation of everything she believed about herself, that she was broken, that she was wrong, that she didn't belong. "It's okay," Principal Davis said, still kind, but Sarah could hear the slight edge of awkwardness in his voice. Even he didn't know what to do with a child who couldn't speak. Then, from the parents' section, a woman's voice cut through the gymnasium loud enough to hear. "Why is she even here if she can't speak?" The voice was sharp, judgmental, delivered as if asking a genuine question to her companion but clearly meant to be heard. "What's wrong with her?" Sarah's eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She stood there, frozen, while Principal Davis tried to salvage the moment by asking leading questions. "Well, what made you choose the sunset? Did you paint it from a photo or from imagination?" His attempts to help just made it worse, drawing out the torture, prolonging her public breakdown. She finally managed to shake her head, a tiny movement, and Davis gently said, "That's all right. Let's give Sarah a hand for her incredible artwork." The applause that followed felt different this time, pity mixed with awkwardness, not celebration. Sarah walked off the stage on shaking legs. She sat back down in her assigned seat, her hands clenched so tightly that her fingernails left crescents in her palms. The rest of the assembly continued, but she heard nothing. She was trapped inside her own head, replaying that moment over and over. The silence, the laughter, the woman's voice questioning why she even existed at this school. The day dragged on. During lunch, Madison approached her with a sympathetic expression that somehow made everything worse. "That was really brave," Madison said, clearly trying to be nice. But what Sarah heard was, "That was really pathetic." By the time her mother picked her up, Sarah felt completely hollow, like someone had reached inside her chest and removed everything essential. That night Sarah sat at the dinner table and her mother asked, "So, how did the assembly go?" Sarah looked at her parents, these people who loved her, who believed in her, who wanted so desperately for her to be okay. And then she said the words she'd been thinking all day. "I'm not going back to school. Not tomorrow, not ever." Her parents exchanged worried glances, reached for her daughter's hand. "Sarah." "I mean it," Sarah interrupted, her voice barely audible. "I can't do this anymore, I'm done." That was the moment everything broke. Not the assembly itself, but the realization that things couldn't continue as they had been. Something fundamental had to change, or Sarah would simply cease to exist. Hadn't slept in 37 hours. She knew this because she'd been counting, tracking the hours like a prisoner marking days on a cell wall. Her daughter had been in her bedroom since the assembly disaster, refusing to come out except to use the bathroom. No meals eaten. No homework completed. No communication beyond the occasional tearless, hollow-eyed stare. David had taken 3 days off work, something he never did. They tried everything. Therapists, Sarah wouldn't speak to them. Gentle encouragement, Sarah just shook her head. Promises of rewards, nothing motivated her anymore. They'd even considered homeschooling but knew that wasn't a solution. It was just postponing the inevitable crisis while Sarah's world continued to shrink. On Thursday night, desperate and exhausted, sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She scrolled through articles about selective mutism, reading clinical definitions that didn't capture the reality of watching your child slowly disappear. She clicked through therapy forums, read heartbreaking parent testimonies, and was about to close the browser in defeat when a Facebook post appeared in her feed. It was from her friend, someone she'd known since college but hadn't spoken to in years. The image showed a German shepherd with a police officer at what appeared to be a children's hospital. The caption read, "Officer and K9 partner Duke visits sick children. This amazing therapy dog helped my son open up about his anxiety. Life-changing." Read the comments. A mother whose autistic daughter had become more social after meeting Duke. A parent whose son with ADHD had finally felt understood. Stories upon stories of children transformed by this officer and his dog. Her hands shook as she clicked on Officer's public profile. He was real, a Portland Police Department officer with a full page dedicated to his therapy dog work. Photos showed Duke at schools, hospitals, nursing homes, community centers. But what struck most was the comments. Hundreds of them. Thousands. People sharing their stories of how this man and his dog had made a difference. Without letting herself overthink it, found the police department's contact number and dialed at 6 a.m. Friday morning, before anyone else would be awake. Portland Police Department, non-emergency line. A tired dispatcher answered. "Hi, I'm trying to reach Officer," said, her voice breaking slightly. "It's about his therapy dog program. My daughter," she stopped, realizing how desperate she sounded. "Is this something I can call about?" There was a pause. Then, "Let me transfer you to the Community Outreach Department." 10 minutes later was explaining Sarah's situation to Officer himself. She didn't plan to cry, but the moment she started talking about the assembly, about the woman's cruel voice, about her daughter refusing to leave her room, the tears came. She told him about selective mutism, about years of struggling, about the school's inability to understand. Listened without interrupting. When finally ran out of words, he simply said, "Bring her over. Tell her Duke is waiting to meet her. No promises, but I've worked with kids like your daughter before. Duke has a gift." Hung up, her heart simultaneously lifted and terrified. What if this didn't work? What if was just another well-meaning adult who couldn't possibly understand what Sarah was going through? Saturday morning arrived. approached Sarah's bedroom door with the same trepidation someone might approach a lion's den. "Sarah, I want to introduce you to someone," said gently. "There's a police officer with a special dog. His name is, and his dog's name is Duke. Would you like to meet them? At our house, just us." Sarah didn't respond. She lay on her bed, staring at the wall like it might suddenly open up and offer her an escape route. "I know you're scared," continued. "I know everything feels impossible right now, but this dog, he's not like people. He doesn't expect you to be anything other than what you are." After 15 minutes of silence, Sarah gave a barely perceptible nod. It wasn't enthusiastic. It wasn't even willing. But it was movement. It was the first sign of engagement had seen in days. At 2 p.m., a police cruiser pulled up to their house. From the window, watched a tall officer in uniform step out, and in the back seat, a massive German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes gazed out at the world. Officer looked exactly how I'd imagined. Kind eyes, steady demeanor, someone who clearly loved his partner deeply. Sarah had retreated to the top of the stairs, where she could observe without being fully present. Answered the door. Mrs. extended his hand warmly. "I'm and this is Duke. Thanks for giving us a chance." "Come in," said, glancing up at where Sarah was barely visible in the shadows of the upstairs hallway. Entered casually, Duke at his side. The dog moved with grace and purpose, clearly trained, clearly professional. But when Duke's eyes landed on the spot where Sarah hid, something shifted in the dog's demeanor. His ears perked forward. His entire body seemed to focus with laser precision on the frightened girl at the top of the stairs. Duke said softly, "Come on, buddy." But Duke didn't approach aggressively or eagerly. Instead, he walked past the living room, past the couch, and positioned himself about 15 feet from where Sarah stood. Then, with a gentleness that contradicted his massive size, Duke lowered himself onto the carpet. He didn't lie down completely, his body remained alert, ready, but he brought himself lower, smaller, less intimidating. His chin rested on his front paws. His brown eyes looked up at Sarah, with an expression that seemed impossibly understanding. Sarah's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow. "He's not going to bother you," said, settling into a chair with the ease of someone completely comfortable in any situation. "Duke knows when people need space. He's good at reading people, better than most humans, honestly. He can sense when someone's scared or hurting, and he's decided you're worth his attention, which means you must be pretty special." Sarah didn't move, but her eyes, those frightened, hollow eyes, were fixed on Duke, and Duke in return watched her with unwavering patience. Felt something shift inside her. She watched her traumatized daughter and this enormous police dog regarding each other across the living room, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a tiny spark of hope. "Sarah," said casually, as if he were talking to an old friend rather than a terrified child who couldn't speak, "what I love about Duke is that he doesn't need you to talk. He just needs you to be honest. Dogs can sense when people are being real or fake. That's his superpower. He knows you're being real right now. That's why he's interested." Sarah still didn't speak, but she took one small step down the stairs, then another. Slowly, carefully, like she was navigating a tightrope, she made her way into the living room. She stopped about 4 feet from Duke, maintaining a safe distance. Duke's tail thumped softly against the carpet, not the excited, chaotic tail wagging of an untrained dog, but a measured, controlled acknowledgement. "I see you," the tail wag seemed to say. "I understand." Sarah sank to her knees on the carpet, still several feet away from Duke, and for the first time since the assembly, she didn't look terrified. She looked like a girl who'd found something, or someone, who accepted her exactly as she was. "Take your time," whispered to Sarah, though she couldn't have heard him. It was more of a reminder to everyone in the room that healing wouldn't come in a rush. It would come in quiet moments, in trust carefully built, in the silent language that exists between two souls who understand each other without words. And in that living room on a Saturday afternoon, something fundamental began to shift. The first week after that initial meeting, Sarah asked her mother a question, actually asked, using real words spoken out loud at home: can and Duke come back? It was such a simple request, barely 6 words, but to it felt like her daughter was slowly, miraculously returning from wherever she disappeared to. Agreed to weekly Thursday afternoon sessions. What started as tentative visits transformed into something neither Sarah nor her parents could have predicted. A healing ritual that became the anchor point of Sarah's entire week. Session 2 arrived on a gray Portland afternoon. Sarah waited by the window watching for the police cruiser. When Duke walked steadily up to the front door, something in Sarah's chest unclenched. She remembered him. He remembered her. That simple fact felt monumental. This time, Sarah didn't hide. She sat on the couch as talked about Duke's training, explaining how the dog learned to respond to different emotions. Duke can actually sense cortisol in your sweat, explained, the stress hormone your body produces when you're anxious. He's trained to recognize it and provide comfort before you even realize you need it. As if on cue, Duke padded over and rested his head on Sarah's knee. She froze. Then slowly, her small hand came down and touched his soft fur. Said nothing. He just sat there, giving her space to exist in this moment without commentary or expectation. Session 3. Sarah sat beside Duke instead of across from him. She stroked his ears while talked about Duke's day at the police station, the other officers, the dispatch calls, the routine. Nothing required a response from Sarah. She could just listen, and that was enough. Session 4 was when everything changed. Had been describing a training exercise Duke performed that week, how the dog learned to alert officers to potential danger by specific bark patterns. As he explained, Sarah leaned down toward Duke's ear and in a voice so faint almost missed it, whispered, "Good boy." Felt tears prick his eyes. He'd worked with dozens of children with selective mutism over his years in the community outreach program, but these moments never got old. He never took them for granted. He knew what this whisper meant. It was Sarah saying, "I trust you. I feel safe. I'm trying." He didn't make a big deal of it. He didn't celebrate or draw attention to what she'd done. He simply continued talking about Duke's achievements as if nothing remarkable had just occurred. But internally, he was already mentally nodding this breakthrough, this moment when Sarah's voice, however quiet, had entered this space. The following weeks revealed a pattern. Sarah's whispered words remained rare and soft, but they came with increasing frequency. "That's nice," she whispered while described Duke's interaction with a therapy patient at the hospital. "Pretty," she whispered while looking at a photo of Duke playing in the park. Single words, barely audible, but they were words. By session 7, Sarah had begun bringing something new, drawings. She handed a piece of paper, her hands shaking slightly. On it was Duke, rendered in colored pencil with enormous wings sprouting from his back. The dog was flying through a sky filled with stars, and beneath him, smaller figures, children, were reaching upward, their faces glowing. "This is incredible," said sincerely. "Sarah, this is really beautiful. Can I keep this?" Sarah nodded and hung it above his desk at the police station. He didn't tell her this at first. He wanted her to decide if she wanted to hear about it. But the following week, when she returned for her session, he mentioned casually, "I put that drawing in my office. I asked who created it. I told them it was someone very talented." Sarah's eyes widened. She'd never considered that her art might matter to anyone beyond her parents and teachers. She'd always been told her talent was exceptional, but she'd never believed it. Not really. Not when she was so fundamentally broken in every other way. That session, Sarah whispered 3 words, "Can I draw more?" Over the next few sessions, Sarah created an entire portfolio of drawings featuring Duke. Duke underwater, breathing like a fish. Duke as a superhero, cape streaming behind him. Duke sitting with children in a circle, a protective guardian. displayed each one proudly, and gradually Sarah began asking what happened to each picture, where kept them, and whether his liked them. In week 10, something shifted again. Sarah brought a colored pencil set she'd gotten as a gift years ago, still in its original packaging. She handed it to without explanation. "What's this?" he asked. She whispered, barely audible, "For, if you want to, draw with me sometime." It was the longest sequence of words she'd spoken to him since that first day. Set the pencils down very carefully, like they were made of spun glass. "I'd really like that," he said. "But Sarah, I'm not very good at drawing. You're the artist. How about we set up a proper art corner during my visits?" From that point forward, Thursday afternoons became something different. Would bring a portable easel, sketch pads, and colored pencils. They'd sit side by side, Sarah on one side, Duke between them like a living bridge, and on the other. While Sarah drew, attempted basic stick figures and abstract shapes that made her smile. Not laugh, Sarah still wasn't laughing, but smile. A real smile that reached her eyes. She began narrating her drawings, whispering explanations of what she was creating. "This is Duke as a guardian angel," she whispered in week 12. "He watches over scared kids and makes them feel brave." "That's what he does," affirmed. "You understand Duke really well." By week 14, Sarah asked a question, actually asked in her whispery voice. "Will you teach me how police dogs are trained?" Spent the entire session explaining the rigorous training process, Duke's certifications, the commands he knew, the situations he'd helped resolve. Sarah listened intently, occasionally whispering follow-up questions. "How long did it take? Does it hurt his ears when sirens go? Can he choose when to help, or is he forced?" The last question struck deeply. It revealed something profound about how Sarah's mind worked. Her empathy extended even to animals. She understood what it felt like to have choices removed, to be forced into situations beyond your control, to have no autonomy over your own voice. "Duke gets to choose," explained carefully. "We train him to offer comfort, but he decides when and how. I never force him to do anything. That's the difference between control and partnership." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her pencil still in her hand. Then she whispered, "I want that, a partnership, not someone telling me what to do." "You already have that," said gently. "With Duke, and with me, we're partners in your healing, Sarah. That means I listen to what you need and you decide the pace." In that moment, something fundamental shifted in Sarah's understanding. All her life, people had been trying to fix her, force her to speak, push her beyond her anxiety. But Duke weren't trying to change her. They were accepting her and walking alongside her, letting her set the pace of her own transformation. Session 15 arrived on a crisp afternoon in late September. Sarah walked to meet Duke at the door without hesitation. She sat beside Duke immediately and began drawing without being asked. And while she drew, she whispered, not to, but to Duke, a running commentary about her day, her fears, her small victories. "Watch this girl who couldn't speak in her school, couldn't raise her hand in class, couldn't exist in the world's view, communicate freely with a dog." And he understood that this wasn't the endpoint of Sarah's journey. It was the beginning. She was learning through Duke that her voice mattered. That communication didn't have to be loud to be powerful. That sometimes the whisper is exactly what's needed. "I want to bring you and Duke to Riverside Elementary," said during session 16, as casually as someone might mention the weather. Sarah froze mid-pencil stroke. Her drawing, a portrait of Duke's face with his soulful eyes, became a chaotic line as her hand jerked involuntarily. "Not as a student," continued quickly, reading her panic. "As my assistant. The school has asked if Duke and I can do a presentation about therapy dogs during the monthly assembly. I specifically requested you." The pencil fell from Sarah's hand. She couldn't go back to that school, that place where she'd been humiliated, that gymnasium where 800 students had watched her fail, that building that now felt like a monument to her own brokenness. She shook her head violently and pushed the sketch pad away. I know this feels impossible, said, but hear me out. This isn't about you being a student sitting in the audience. This is about you being an expert. You understand Duke better than almost anyone I know. You know his training, his personality, his quirks. You know what it feels like to communicate without words, and Duke responds to that. I need you up there because you're the only person who can show those kids what real connection looks like. Sarah looked then at Duke, then back at. The dog lifted his head and trotted over to her, resting his chin on her knee, his signature move, the thing he did when she was anxious. You don't have to speak, continued. Not once. You'll guide Duke through commands using hand signals and gestures. I'll do all the talking. You'll just be present. And I promise you, when kids see how Duke responds to you, when they watch you communicate with him perfectly without saying a word, their entire perspective will change. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah practiced the presentation at the house. They worked on her hand signals, refined her positioning, rehearsed the exact sequence of commands. Duke knew all of these exercises perfectly: sit, stay, heel, alert. But what mattered now was that Sarah executed them with confidence. You're the handler, reminded her repeatedly. Duke looks to you. He trusts your direction. When you give a command, you own it. Don't second-guess yourself. You know what to do. The night before the assembly, Sarah barely slept. She lay in bed, her mind replaying the last assembly, the awful, crushing failure. But this time she had something different. She had Duke. And she had belief in her. It wasn't enough to make the anxiety disappear, but it was enough to make the thought of facing it feel less like suicide. The morning of the presentation, Sarah dressed carefully in clothes that felt strong and capable. Her mother braided her hair. Her father made her favorite pancakes, even though Sarah could barely eat. At 8:47 a.m., pulled into their driveway with Duke in the back of the cruiser. You ready? Asked as he clipped on Duke's professional service vest, the one that indicated he was working, not playing. Sarah nodded, even though her stomach was performing gymnastics. The drive to Riverside Elementary took 12 minutes. To Sarah, it felt like 12 seconds and 12 years simultaneously. They pulled into the parking lot. The building loomed before her, familiar and terrifying, parked by the gymnasium entrance. Sarah, he said, turning to face her directly, look at me. She did. You are not the same girl who stood on that stage 6 months ago. You're braver, you're stronger, you understand yourself better, and you have Duke. That changes everything. They entered through the side door. The gymnasium was already starting to fill with students. Sarah kept her eyes on Duke, on the steady rhythm of his breathing, on the way his muscles moved beneath his fur. If she focused on him, she could pretend the gymnasium wasn't there. She could pretend there weren't hundreds of eyes that would soon be watching her. Led her to a side area where they waited. Principal Davis spotted them and came over, extending his hand too. Officer, great to have you here. And Sarah, Davis paused, seeming to remember the last assembly. This should be a wonderful experience. The principal's tone suggested he was trying very hard to be encouraging about the girl who'd frozen on stage before. Sarah wanted to disappear into the floor. At 10:15 a.m., the gymnasium doors closed. Every student in the 5th and 6th grades was seated. Sarah counted the sections. Her anxiety always made her count things. 9 bleacher sections, roughly 80 students per section. That was too many. She stopped counting. Good morning, everyone. Principal Davis's voice boomed through the speakers. Today we have Officer and his partner Duke from the Portland Police Department. They're going to teach us about therapy dogs and the incredible work these animals do in our community. Please give them a warm welcome. The applause seemed to vibrate through Sarah's entire body. Walked onto the stage with Duke, and Sarah followed, her legs moving like she was wading through water. The gymnasium lights felt even brighter than last time. This is Duke, announced, his voice warm and confident. He's a trained police K9 and certified therapy dog, But what makes Duke special isn't just his training, it's his intuition about people. Duke knows when someone is scared, sad, or hurting. He can sense emotions through chemical signals in our bodies. Today, I want to show you how Duke works. Gestured toward Sarah. This is Sarah. She's going to demonstrate Duke's training with me. Sarah, are you ready? Sarah's throat was so tight she could barely breathe. But she looked at Duke, and Duke looked at her with those intelligent brown eyes, and she gave a subtle nod. Okay, Duke, watch, Sarah said. Sarah raised her left hand in the signal for sit. Duke sat immediately, his haunches hitting the ground with precision. The gymnasium went silent, not the terrified silence of her last assembly, but an attentive, impressed silence. Sarah gave the signal for stay. Duke held position. She walked around him in a circle, and he tracked her with his eyes but didn't move. Another signal, heel. Duke rose and walked beside her in perfect synchronization, his body aligned with her leg. Another down. Duke dropped to the floor in an alert position. Each command executed flawlessly. Each movement met with soft gasps and murmurs of amazement from the bleachers. Sarah felt something shifting inside her, not just her anxiety decreasing, but her sense of self expanding. She wasn't the broken girl who couldn't speak. She was a girl who could communicate perfectly with a 90-pound police dog. She was an expert. She was capable. What you're witnessing, explained to the crowd, is real partnership. Sarah doesn't use words to direct Duke. She uses body language, hand signals, and something else, something that goes beyond language. It's trust. Duke trusts Sarah completely, and Sarah understands Duke deeply. They communicate in a way that's actually more sophisticated than words. Paused, letting his gaze move across the gymnasium. How many of you sometimes feel like you can't be heard, like nobody listens to you? Several hands went up. Sarah knows that feeling, continued. But Sarah also knows something else, that communication exists in many forms, that being understood doesn't always require words, that sometimes the deepest connections are the ones that exist beyond language. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes, but they weren't tears of shame this time. They were tears of recognition, was telling the entire gymnasium about her, not her disability, but her strength. Now said, I want to show you something special. Sarah, can you do me a favor? Sarah looked at him, wondering what came next. This hadn't been part of their rehearsal. Just pet Duke, said. Show him how much you care. Sarah knelt down and wrapped her arms around Duke's neck, burying her face in his fur. She whispered something, words no one else could hear, directly to the dog. In that moment, Duke did something he'd never done before in any presentation, any training session, any moment with anyone else. He lowered his head slowly and pressed it against Sarah's chest, his eyes closing. It was a gesture of pure acceptance, of honoring someone's courage, of saying without words, you matter. You are worthy. I see you. The gymnasium erupted. Students stood up. Teachers gasped. Several people applauded, then more, then everyone. It wasn't just applause, it was recognition. It was witnessing. It was transformation happening in real time. And Sarah, with Duke's head against her heart and 800 pairs of eyes finally seeing her for who she really was, found something she thought she'd lost forever: hope. The gymnasium fell silent in a way that silence shouldn't be possible when 800 people occupy the same space. It was the kind of silence that exists in sacred moments, when something transcendent has just occurred, and no one wants to break the spell by speaking. Sarah remained on her knees, her arms around Duke's neck, her face buried in his fur. She didn't see what was happening in the bleachers. She didn't see the students standing up. She didn't see teachers with their hands over their mouths, eyes glistening with tears. She didn't see the parents in the back row gripping each other's arms, or the parent who'd made that cruel comment 6 months ago, now looking at Sarah with an expression of complete remorse. All Sarah knew was that Duke had just done something she'd never felt him do before. His head, usually held high with alert confidence, had lowered completely. He'd pressed his forehead against her chest, his massive body becoming somehow smaller, softer, more vulnerable. It wasn't a command she'd given. It wasn't a trained behavior. It was something else entirely, something that looked remarkably like respect, like reverence, like one being honoring another. Standing to the side, felt his eyes burning with tears he'd never expected. In his 15 years working with therapy dogs, he trained hundreds of animals. He'd seen Duke perform incredible feats of courage and compassion, but he'd never witnessed this. And he understood in that crystalline moment that what was happening wasn't just a dog performing a trick. It was a sacred acknowledgement passing between two souls who understood each other's pain. "What you're witnessing," said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "is something extraordinary. Duke has just shown you his most profound gesture. He does this rarely, only when he encounters someone with a pure heart, someone who has suffered and survived that suffering, someone who refuses to let their pain make them bitter. He bows his head to people who demonstrate genuine strength." The gymnasium remained absolutely still. Then slowly, tentatively, a single person began to clap. It was Principal Davis. Then another person joined, a teacher in the third bleacher. Then another. Then the applause built, not in the polite, obligatory way of a school assembly, but in the way that erupts when people have witnessed something they know they'll remember for the rest of their lives. Sarah lifted her head, tears streaming down her face, and saw the gymnasium on its feet. 800 students, teachers, parents, all standing, all clapping, all looking directly at her. But this time it wasn't the cruel gaze that had destroyed her 6 months ago. This was different. This was witnessing. This was seeing her. Duke lifted his head and licked her cheek once, gently, his dark eyes never leaving hers. Backstage, after the presentation ended, Sarah couldn't move. She sat on a bench in the hallway outside the gymnasium, still in a state of shock. Sat beside her, giving her space to process. "Did that really happen?" Sarah whispered. "Yes," said. "And Sarah, I want you to understand something. What Duke did, that wasn't me directing him. I didn't teach him to bow his head to you in that moment. That was Duke making his own choice. Dogs don't fake emotion. That was real recognition from one being to another." Over the next hour, people kept coming to find Sarah. Teachers who dismissed her selective mutism as behavioral issues asked how they could better support her. The guidance counselor mentioned bringing in a specialist to train the entire faculty on anxiety disorders. Principal Davis personally apologized for not understanding her needs more deeply. Even some of her classmates approached nervously, wanting to hear the story, wanting to understand this girl who could communicate perfectly with a police dog. But the most significant moment came when a woman approached, and Sarah, the same woman whose voice had cut through the gymnasium 6 months earlier with that cruel question, "Why is she even here if she can't speak?" "I owe this young lady an apology," the woman said, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I said something terrible 6 months ago. I didn't understand selective mutism. I thought she was just being difficult, or I don't know. When I saw her with that dog today, when I saw that animal recognize her in that way, I realized something. That girl is stronger than I'll ever be." Sarah felt something inside her shift, not forgiveness exactly, but a release of the anger she'd been carrying. The woman's cruelty had hurt, but Sarah was learning that cruelty usually came from ignorance, and ignorance could be transformed into understanding. That evening, the video of the presentation was uploaded to the school's social media. By the next morning, it had been shared over 10,000 times. Local news outlets picked up the story. The headline read, "Police Dog's Emotional Recognition of Girl with Selective Mutism Moves Community." Within days, the narrative had shifted completely. Sarah went from being the girl who can't speak to being the girl who communicates on a deeper level. The school district reached out too, asking if he could conduct training sessions for teachers about selective mutism and anxiety disorders. The principal mentioned possibly implementing a more structured support system for students with communication challenges. But more importantly than any of these external changes, Something fundamental shifted inside Sarah. She began speaking more, not dramatically, not suddenly fluent in all situations, but incrementally. A whisper in math class, a few words to the school counselor, a short phrase to a teacher in the hallway. Each time she spoke, she remembered Duke's head against her chest, that gesture of pure acceptance. She remembered that 800 people had stood up to honor her, not because she'd spoken, but because she'd demonstrated courage. A week after the assembly, Sarah asked if she could keep one of her drawings of Duke at school, helped her frame it. She hung it in the school's main hallway, not hidden away in the art room or the counselor's office, but in a prominent place where everyone would see it. The drawing showed Duke with wings, exactly as Sarah had envisioned, surrounded by children reaching upward. The plaque beneath it read, "Created by Sarah, selective mutism doesn't define capability, courage does." Sarah would pass that drawing dozens of times throughout her day, and each time she did, she felt a little stronger. She felt seen. She felt like her story mattered. That night, Sarah's mother found her sitting in the backyard, sketching by the last light of the setting sun. She was drawing Duke again, but this time, the dog wasn't flying or performing superhero feats. He was simply sitting peacefully, his head slightly bowed in that familiar gesture of respect. "What are you drawing?" asked, sitting beside her daughter. "Duke's showing me what respect looks like," Sarah said quietly. "He doesn't care that I can't speak in front of people. He knows I'm strong anyway." Squeezed her daughter's shoulder, not saying anything, because sometimes words aren't needed. Sometimes silence is exactly enough. But inside's chest, she felt something she'd thought had been lost. The absolute certainty that her daughter was going to be okay. More than okay. She was going to be extraordinary. 2 weeks after the assembly, the Portland School District received an unexpected request from Principal Davis. They wanted to host an all-staff training on selective mutism and anxiety disorders in young people. Within a month, Dr. Reeves, a clinical psychologist specializing in childhood anxiety, was conducting a workshop for every teacher at Riverside Elementary. Sarah sat in the back of the gymnasium, watching her teachers, the very people who dismissed her, misunderstood her, occasionally judged her, lean forward intently as Dr. Reeves explained what selective mutism actually was. Not willful defiance or behavioral problems, but a genuine anxiety disorder rooted in neurobiology. It was involuntary. It was real. And it didn't indicate anything about the student's intelligence, capability, or character. Many children with selective mutism are incredibly bright, Dr. Reeves explained, projecting a slide with statistics. They often experience perfectionism, high anxiety, and profound empathy. Their inability to speak in certain contexts is not a choice or a character flaw. It's a symptom of anxiety that deserves treatment and accommodation, not punishment. As Dr. Reeves spoke, Sarah watched her teachers' faces shift. Mrs., who'd sighed when Sarah couldn't read her essay aloud, now looked deeply regretful. The English teacher who'd marked Sarah's participation grades down because she contributed nothing to class discussions was taking notes furiously. Even Principal Davis, who'd seemed kind but confused during the assembly, now appeared to be rethinking every interaction he'd had with selective mutism students over his entire career. At lunch that day, something remarkable happened. Madison, the same girl who'd felt uncomfortable around Sarah, who'd stopped inviting her to sit with her friend group, approached Sarah's table. "Hi," Madison said nervously, "can I sit here?" Sarah, startled, gestured to the empty seat across from her. "I watched that training thing," Madison continued, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "The one about selective mutism, and I realized I've been a total jerk to you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She'd spent so long being angry at Madison for abandoning her. But looking at Madison now, she saw just another kid who hadn't understood. "I didn't know it was a real thing," Madison continued. "I thought you were just being weird or snobby or something, but you're not. You were just scared the whole time and I made it worse. I'm sorry." Sarah found her voice, that whisper that was becoming more accessible, more present. "Thank you for saying that." Madison's eyes widened. It was the most she'd ever heard Sarah speak directly to her. "Will you, maybe eat lunch with me and my friends sometimes? No pressure, just if you want to." Sarah nodded, and something that had been broken between them began to heal. Over the following weeks, the school transformed in subtle but profound ways. Teachers stopped cold calling on Sarah in ways that expected verbal responses. Instead, they offered her written answer options or the chance to respond privately. They stopped marking her participation down when she raised her hand, but then froze. They began acknowledging that presence and effort mattered just as much as verbal output. Sarah's math teacher, Mr. Harrison, implemented a new system where students could submit written reflections on problems instead of discussing them aloud. Sarah's grades improved immediately, not because she suddenly understood math better, but because she was no longer being punished for her anxiety. She could actually demonstrate what she knew. In language arts, Mrs. started offering Sarah the option to record voice journals instead of doing live presentations. Sarah's voice, recorded privately, flowed beautifully. Her insights about literature were sophisticated and thoughtful. Mrs. realized she'd been underestimating this student's entire academic capacity because of one dimension of her anxiety. But the changes weren't just academic. The social dynamics shifted too. The kids who'd mocked Sarah now seemed almost embarrassed by how they'd treated her. Devin, who'd rolled his eyes during that first classroom moment, actually apologized one day in the hallway. "I didn't get it," he said awkwardly. "I thought you were just refusing to talk, but I watched that video like 50 times. That dog bowing to you. That was the coolest thing I've ever seen." Sarah smiled, "Thanks." And with each small positive interaction, something inside Sarah began to loosen. The anxiety didn't disappear. She still felt its grip when entering new situations, but its power diminished. She was learning what Duke had been trying to teach her all along. Her worth wasn't dependent on her voice. It was inherent. It existed whether she spoke or not. By November, Sarah was speaking more regularly in structured situations. She'd raise her hand in class and whisper her answer to the teacher. She'd participate in small group discussions if she felt safe with the group. She even gave a brief, quiet presentation in science class, only 3 minutes long, her voice barely audible, but she did it. And when she finished, her classmates applauded not because they were impressed by what she said, but because they understood the courage it had taken for her to say it. The drawing she'd created, the one of Duke with wings, had become almost a symbol at the school. Other students began creating art in response to it. One student created a sculpture of a girl reaching toward the sky. Another created a painting of wings and transformation. The art hallway became a gallery of responses to Sarah's original piece, each one exploring themes of courage, acceptance, and finding your voice. Sarah found herself becoming an unlikely role model. Children who struggled with their own anxiety started seeking her out. A first grader with selective mutism asked if she could show her how to talk to Officer Duke. Sarah, in her quiet way, became a mentor to other kids who felt broken. One afternoon in early December, the school counselor, Mrs. Martinez, asked if Sarah would be willing to participate in a panel discussion about anxiety disorders. Other students with various anxiety conditions would speak, or in some cases, write their contributions about their experiences. "You don't have to speak," Mrs. Martinez said carefully, "but your perspective matters. These other kids need to know they're not alone." Sarah whispered her agreement. At home, she prepared. She wasn't preparing to speak, she was preparing to be present. She wrote down some thoughts, drew some images, created a visual presentation about her journey with selective mutism. When the panel discussion arrived in late January, Sarah sat at a table in front of about 60 students, mostly in the middle school grades. A girl with OCD spoke about intrusive thoughts. A boy with ADHD talked about executive dysfunction. Then it was Sarah's turn. She didn't speak. She simply showed her presentation, narrated quietly by Mrs. Martinez reading Sarah's written reflections. As each image appeared on the screen, Duke with wings, the gymnasium full of students, the framed drawing in the hallway, Sarah whispered answers to students' questions. "How did it feel when you couldn't speak?" a brave sixth grader asked. "Like I was drowning," Sarah whispered. "Like my body was betraying me." "What helped?" another student asked. "Someone who understood," Sarah answered. "Someone who didn't try to fix me. Someone who just accepted me while I figured things out." That answer seemed to land deeply with the students in the audience. Several were crying. Several were taking notes. And Sarah realized in that moment that her story, her struggle, her pain, her journey was valuable, not because she'd overcome it perfectly or suddenly become fluent, but because she'd survived it authentically, and that survival could help others survive theirs. That evening, her parents took her out for dinner. They went to her favorite restaurant, the Thai place downtown. As Sarah sat between her parents, eating pad Thai and feeling genuinely, deeply okay for perhaps the first time in years, her father reached over and squeezed her hand. "You know what I'm proud of?" David asked. Sarah shook her head. "I'm not proud that you're speaking more," he continued. "I'm proud that you're learning to believe in yourself. That's the real transformation." Sarah squeezed his hand back, and in that gesture, that simple human connection, she felt everything she needed to feel. She was becoming whole not by speaking louder but by speaking truer, by trusting herself, by believing that her voice, however quiet, however different, mattered. 1 year after the assembly presentation, Principal Davis sent another letter. This one arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Sarah and family. Opened it at the kitchen table while Sarah was upstairs doing homework, and when she read the contents, she immediately called her daughter downstairs. "Sarah, you won't believe this," said, holding the letter. "They want you to speak at the end-of-year assembly, as a student speaker, talking about your experience with anxiety and selective mutism." Sarah's stomach dropped, speaking at an assembly in front of the entire school, again. "I know it's scary," her mother continued, "but think about how far you've come. You could do this, and Duke could be there with you if you want them to be." Sarah spent the next 3 weeks preparing. This time, it wasn't preparation born from terror. It was preparation born from intention. She wrote her speech by hand, crossed out sentences, rewrote them. She read it aloud to her parents multiple times. She practiced with Duke in their weekly Thursday sessions. "This is different," told her. "Last year I was doing the talking and you were demonstrating. This time it's your story, your voice, your truth. Duke and I are just here to support you." The night before the assembly, Sarah barely slept, but this time it was from anticipation rather than dread. She lay in bed rehearsing her speech in her head, feeling the words, imagining how they would land with an audience. Her father came into her room around midnight and sat on the edge of her bed. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I keep thinking about what I'm going to say," Sarah admitted. "Are you scared?" Sarah considered this. "A little, but not like before. It's a different kind of scared. It's like, I'm scared of failing myself, not of being judged." David felt tears burn his eyes. His daughter had come so far. "That's a kind of fear that means something good is about to happen," he said. "That fear means you care about something real." The morning of the assembly arrived clear and bright. Sarah dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that made her feel strong. She pulled her hair back in a neat braid. Her mother made her favorite breakfast. Her father drove her to school, and when they arrived, Duke were already waiting in the front office. "You ready?" asked, seeing Sarah walk in. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. This time she believed it. The gymnasium filled throughout the morning. By 10 a.m., all 800 students were seated. Teachers stood along the sides. Parents filled the back bleachers. Sarah waited backstage with Duke, her heart racing but her mind clear. Principal Davis opened the assembly with announcements and awards just like before. But this time, Sarah wasn't hiding. She was waiting. She was ready. Our final speaker today is someone who has demonstrated extraordinary courage this year, Principal Davis said into the microphone. She's taught our entire school community about the power of acceptance and the many forms that communication can take. Please welcome Sarah, with support from Officer and K-9 Duke. The applause began before Sarah even stepped onto the stage. It was warm, welcoming, genuinely excited, not the pitying, uncomfortable sound of the previous year. Sarah walked to center stage, and Duke followed, and Duke lay down in his familiar position, alert but calm, present but not demanding attention. Sarah stood at the microphone, her hands trembling slightly as she placed her speech pages down. She looked out at the gymnasium, 800 faces, 800 potential judges, but she also saw acceptance. She saw people who'd learned. She saw a community that had shifted. She opened her mouth and began to speak. My name is Sarah and I have selective mutism. Her voice was soft, barely audible through the gymnasium at first. She paused, took a breath, and continued. For most of my life, I thought this meant something was wrong with me. I thought it meant I was broken. A hush fell over the gymnasium. Everyone leaned forward. When I was in 5th grade, I couldn't speak in public. I still can't completely. Even now, my voice is shaking, and this is terrifying. She paused, acknowledging her own fear. But I've learned something important this year. Speaking isn't the only way to communicate, and being scared doesn't mean you should stop trying. Sarah picked up her pages with slightly steadier hands. 6 months ago, I stood on this stage and couldn't say a word. People laughed. Someone asked why I was even here. I believed I didn't belong. Her voice grew stronger. Then Officer and Duke came into my life. They taught me something that changed everything. They showed me that I was worthy of respect and care exactly as I was. They didn't try to fix me. They didn't judge me. They just believed in me. She looked down at Duke, and the dog's tail thumped softly. Selective mutism isn't something you can willpower your way through, Sarah continued. It's not something you outgrow by being brave one time. It's something you manage by having people around you who understand. Teachers who give you alternatives to speaking. Friends who don't make you feel weird for being quiet. A dog who communicates without words and teaches you that communication takes many forms. Sarah's voice began to find its rhythm now. Not loud, not completely confident, but authentic, real. This year, I've learned that my voice, even when it's barely a whisper, matters. That I can contribute to conversations without always speaking out loud. That I have value even when I'm terrified. That my difference isn't my disability, it's my distinction. Several students in the audience were crying now. So were some of the teachers. I want to speak to anyone here who feels broken, who feels like they don't belong, who feels like something is fundamentally wrong with them, Sarah said, her eyes scanning the gymnasium. You are not broken. You are learning how to exist in a world that wasn't built for you, and that doesn't make you less, it makes you extraordinary. Sarah paused, feeling the weight of her own words. I'm probably always going to have selective mutism. I'm probably always going to feel anxiety in situations like this. But I'm also learning that anxiety can be the sign that you're doing something brave. That fear and courage are not opposites, they're dance partners. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face now, but she didn't stop. Thank you to Officer and Duke for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you to my parents for never giving up on me. Thank you to my teachers who changed how they taught me. Thank you to my classmates who chose kindness. And thank you to everyone who's learning like I'm learning that there's no single way to be human. We're all different, we're all needed, and we're all more powerful together than we could ever be apart. Sarah took a breath. She could feel herself getting emotional, but she pushed through. 1 year ago, I didn't think I would ever come back to school. Today, I'm standing on this stage choosing to speak, even though it's terrifying. That's not because I'm cured or fixed or no longer anxious. It's because I finally understand that my voice, loud or quiet, verbal or written, whispered or spoken, belongs in this world." The gymnasium erupted before she even finished. People stood up. The applause was deafening. Some students were on their feet immediately. Others rose more slowly, wiping tears from their eyes. Teachers applauded with genuine respect. Parents stood in the back bleachers. Sarah stood there, completely overwhelmed, until gently guided her to where Duke was waiting. Sarah knelt down and wrapped her arms around the dog. Duke rested his head on her shoulder, not bowing this time, but simply being present, bearing witness to her triumph. The applause continued for nearly 3 minutes, a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. That evening, the video of Sarah's speech was uploaded by the school. Within 24 hours, it had been shared over 50,000 times. News outlets picked it up. Mental health advocates shared it. Parents of children with anxiety disorders watched it with tears in their eyes, feeling seen, feeling hopeful. But none of that mattered to Sarah. What mattered was that she'd done it. She'd stood up. She'd spoken her truth. She'd let her voice, however quiet, however imperfect, be heard. That night, Sarah sat on the back porch with her parents, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Duke lay with his head in her lap, content and peaceful. "I'm proud of you," her mother said. "I'm proud of you too," her father added. But the person Sarah was most proud of was herself, not for speaking perfectly, not for overcoming her anxiety completely, but for showing up, for being brave, for believing that her voice, however quiet, had power. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah whispered 3 words that she'd never quite believed before but now knew to be absolutely true. "I am enough." Duke's tail thumped in agreement, and in that moment, everything Sarah had fought for came full circle. She hadn't just found her voice. She'd found her worth, and nothing would ever silence that again. The end.